Neil, thank you very much for talking to me this evening. I want to focus this discussion as much as possible on the interaction of politics and economics, and take as much a historical perspective as is comfortable. I understand that historians such as yourself never like to make very tight analogies, that history doesn't repeat itself exactly. So I'm going to take a little liberty in the questions I ask you and kind of assume that you'll tell me when there is not a historical precedent, or where historical precedents don't actually pertain. But the first question I'd really like to ask is that if you think about global financial systems or global financial arrangements, you go back over the last couple of centuries, what kind of events actually shaped the systems that existed? What are the historical forces that come to your mind that result in one kind of system or another? And I just wonder if you could give a couple of examples of how some historical event or some set of forces created a certain kind of system.
Well, to an extent that is not generally recognized, it's been war that has been the biggest driver of financial innovation until really quite recently. For example, public debt as an institution came into existence to finance the conflicts between the city-states of Renaissance Italy. It was war that encouraged bigger European states, in particularly England, to develop national debts that grew to remarkable size in relation to their economies. So war is the father of most, though not all, financial things. And revolutions turn out to be pretty important in financial history too. Again, going back not just over 200 years, but over more like 800, it's remarkable how often big revolutionary changes are followed by major discontinuities in financial history. One reason for this is that, of course, war drives surges in expenditure beyond what taxation can cover. So states have to figure out a way of meeting their needs since tax is not enough. There tend to be two ways of doing this. One is to sell long-term debt to investors in one form or another. The easier option is to print money. And so very often what we see are surges of public borrowing or of money printing, or usually both in times of war. In times of revolution, we often see large accumulated debts being defaulted on, or we see inflations reaching hyperinflation levels. And I'll just give you a couple of examples to illustrate what I mean. One of the biggest defaults in all of history was the default following the Russian Revolution, when the Bolsheviks essentially reneged on the entire Tsarist imperial Russian debt. This was a huge shock for financial markets because for many years prior to 1917-18, Russia had been regarded as a terrific investment opportunity, and investment bankers from all over the Western world had been running around St. Petersburg making a lot of money. So the Great Russian Default of 1918 is a classic example of a moment when the rules changed dramatically and the ex-ante risk premia turn out to have been completely wrong. Now, there have been numerous defaults in the last 100 years, but that, by some calculations, was the biggest. I'll give you another example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. The French Revolution, back in the period after 1789, produced one of the first great paper money inflations of modern times. The assignat currency supposedly secured on the nationalized lands of the church were essentially printed away to being worthless. So we have great financial events, defaults in the case of Russia, inflation in the case of France, associated with war and revolution. In the Russian case, interestingly, the war came first and the revolution followed. In the French case, the revolution came first and then the war followed. But both these events had enormous implications for financial stability. One final point, almost as important as these big discontinuities of default and inflation, have been periods of reform, eras of reform. And I think we could look at the 1980s as an example of a period when, in a non-revolutionary way, institutions changed. This is, of course, particularly true of the English-speaking world, in ways that quite significantly altered the rules of the financial game. We tend to talk about the 1980s rather simplistically in terms of deregulation. Much more was involved than just that. But that's the kind of thing that it seems to me we should also look out for historically. The beginnings of the financial revolution in 18th century England actually lie in the late 17th century Glorious Revolution. So what we're talking about there is not revolution in the French or Russian sense, but something rather less dramatic and less bloodthirsty, which fundamentally changes the financial institutions of a country.
So, and where do you, in this framework, how do you think about the financial system that Britain led for so long based on the gold standard? I know you've written very eloquently about that, but where does that fit into this rhythm of war and revolution and reform after a revolution? How do we? Because that was a fairly long period of stability.
The interesting thing about the gold standard is that nobody sat down and said, let's have an international monetary system that pegs currencies to gold. It evolved. The English decided that they would reform their currency. It was actually the great physicist Isaac Newton who came up with the gold convertibility number. But the rest of the world joined this system gradually, and not only because Britain conquered large parts of the rest of the world. Many countries in the late 19th century opted to join the gold standard because it appeared to have benefits relative to bimetallic systems that used both gold or silver, or paper money systems that didn't use a metal peg at all. So the gold standard evolved from a British idea. It was certainly something that was exported with a lot of other things in the name of the British Empire. But by the late 19th century, countries as diverse as Germany, Japan, and finally the United States voluntarily adopt the rule. And you end up by the eve of the First World War with a system in which nearly all the major currencies in the world have a rule that says if you take a banknote issued by a country's central bank to part of that central bank, you can get a specific agreed amount of gold in return for that note. So that's a short story of how gold became the monetary anchor of the world. Of course, it all blew up in 1914 with the outbreak of the First World War. It turned out, if people had forgotten, that gold was a contingent rule. You could suspend the convertibility to gold in time of war, in time of emergency. The British did that, so did pretty much everybody else. After the First World War, countries attempted to return either to the old pre-war parities or to some new adjusted exchange rate to gold. That system worked pretty badly. And most people would argue, following Barry Eichengreen's argument in Golden Fetters, that returning to gold after World War I was a bad idea and did a great deal to spread if not to start, the Great Depression. Eichengreen's argument is that it was when countries went off gold in the 1930s that they began to see signs of recovery. I tell that part of the story very deliberately because there are still people out there who have a certain nostalgia for the gold standard. Indeed, only the other night somebody was telling me how they thought it might be a good idea if we could only go back onto the gold standard because all this quantitative easing of the Federal Reserve was making them very nervous. And I said it strikes me as a really quite bad idea, particularly in a relatively deflationary world, to try to go back to a system that was pretty deflationary on at least two occasions, the 1930s, but also the gold standard had been pretty deflationary in the 1870s and 1880s. In the end, you're pegging the monetary system to a commodity that is nice looking, very durable, but in pretty short supply. And unless you can contrive, as the Bank of England did, to run a really large banking system with a lot of paper money and bank money relative to a relatively small reserve of gold, you're going to be constrained by gold. And most economies were constrained by gold, especially in the 1870s and the 1930s.
But is the central point about the gold standard, let's set aside whether it was good or bad, but it was the monetary system for a while, that this is a reflection of a historical force of a hegemon. That is, if you have one country, I'm stating this as a hypothesis, but if you have one country that is so powerful, what it does can actually dominate the whole system, and others will key on it, even if there isn't a negotiation. That in effect that was what the U.S. right after the Second World War. There was a negotiation at Bretton Woods, but most of the stuff never worked anyway. So people keyed on the U.S. in the way that they keyed on Britain. Is that too simplistic?
Well, it was the late Charles Kindleberger's argument that the international financial system needs a leader, hegemon, and that Britain had played that role prior to the First World War. The United States played that role after the Second World War. But in the middle, between 1914 and 1945, there wasn't a clear leader, and there was indeed divided hegemony, and that was a bad thing. That's really an argument central to Kindleberger's account of the Depression. I think one has to ask the question, why do other countries gravitate towards a leader?
Yeah.
How far is it the power of an empire that attracts them, and how far is it the convenience of a particular currency? I think we should recognize that the latter probably plays as big a part as the former. The important thing, of course, in understanding how reserve currencies come into existence, in other words, currencies that everybody regards as acceptable, whether as bank reserves or as a means of exchange, has a lot to do with things like trade and capital export. In their heyday, the two great English-speaking empires, first the British, then the American, were able to run considerable surpluses and export capital on a large scale. And it was the availability of sterling in the 19th century, dollars after 1945, that dictated the evolution of first a sterling or gold-based system and later a dollar-based system. It's only with the benefit of hindsight that we say, oh, this happened because they were so powerful. But I'm not sure that there's actually that strong a connection between the military power and the evolution of the monetary system. The monetary system, I think, evolves because the currency is being used internationally in a lot of transactions, and therefore people end up owning it if they trade with the so-called hegemon. That, I think, is really the driving force. Merchants, in the dealings they engage in, are less impressed by cannons, battleships, or for that matter, strategic bombing capability than they are impressed by the availability of a unit of account and a means of exchange that is internationally acceptable. And I think it's the convenience of sterling, it's the ready availability of dollars that really hold the key to this story.
Okay, that's really interesting. Let's stay in the same framework and look ahead at the next decade or even two. You're the only person I'm comfortable talking about even 2 decades. When you think about the historical forces that will be at play in relationship to the kind of global financial system that could evolve, what are some of these forces? I know you have written very eloquently about the U.S. and China. And in one of your books, you talked about a break in that connection would have very major ramifications. I'd like you to expand on that, but are there any other forces, in a sense, that rise to that order of magnitude that, without saying where they would lead, you could say quite definitively, this would really influence the kind of global financial system that we had?
Let me answer that question in 2 halves. The first half is going to be about Chimerica.
Right.
And the second half is going to be about a multipolar global financial system. Chimerica was an idea that I and Moritz Schularik came up with before the crisis. We first started talking about it in late 2006. And our idea was that you couldn't really understand the financial world if you didn't understand the relationship between China and America. And at that time, it was a marriage of opposites, in the sense that the Chinese did the exporting and Americans did the importing. The Chinese did the saving and Americans did the spending and so forth. And this relationship was an odd one because partly as a consequence of China's policy of intervention to prevent the Chinese currency appreciating, China was accumulating enormous numbers of dollars as international reserves, in the trillions of dollars. And this reserve accumulation was like a line of credit to the U.S. economy because effectively the Chinese were buying U.S. treasuries, not to mention various forms of mortgage-backed security underwritten by government-sponsored agencies. So they became huge investors in U.S. Securities, as a consequence of which effectively long-term interest rates in the U.S. were lower than they would otherwise have been. And we saw this as one of the explanations for the extraordinary bubble in real estate and indeed the rapid appreciation of other classes of security in the period prior to 2007 when the whole system began to fall apart. We called it Chimerica because we thought it was a chimera. It was a pun on the word. We didn't think it was sustainable. And it seemed to us inherently odd that a relatively poor country like China should in effect be lending money to a relatively rich country like the United States so that the US could consume, because this money was not being used for very much in the way of sensible investment, unless you count a lot of empty houses in Arizona and Florida and Nevada as a good investment. So that relationship was, I think, very crucial to understanding the crisis. And it is still crucial to understanding where we are now. It came very close to falling apart during the crisis. If you remember, the U.S. administration, when it came in 2009 under President Obama, came close to calling China a currency manipulator. Treasury Secretary Geithner never quite said that once he was Treasury Secretary, but he did use the word in his confirmation hearing. And secondly, the Chinese accused the Americans of engaging in reckless monetary and fiscal policy to try to stabilize their economy after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. So the relationship became very strained during the crisis. And for a time, it looked very unfair because the Chinese had 10% growth and the US had 10% unemployment. Since that low point in 2009, people have come to realize that Chimerica is still a going concern because indeed Chinese stimulus was more successful than American stimulus in generating growth. And China really acted as an engine of growth for the rest of the world in that period, 2009, 10, 11, and 12, when a really large percentage of global growth could be attributed to China's stimulus. And now we find ourselves in a really odd place. in the history of Chimerica. The two parties, the odd couple, have grown rather alike. Both have become addicted to massive monetary stimulus, and neither China nor America seems quite able to end that stimulus, as we saw this summer when they both tried to and then backed away. So that's the first half of my answer to your question. That relationship still really matters. And if both China and America decided to tighten monetary policy simultaneously, if they both, as it were, tapered, we would see a really big fallout for the rest of the world economy. And we must hope that they don't make that mistake. The second half of my answer has to do with a multipolar financial system. Although we were probably right to focus on China and America, in reality, the pre-crisis world was characterized by multiple financial centers. It wasn't just the Chinese who were accumulating claims on the United States. It was the Arab countries, the major oil exporters that were doing it too. If you just look at financial centers, New York, London, keep going down the list, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Singapore, these financial centers are no longer just Western. The new boys in town are Asian, and indeed Hong Kong, by some measures, is close to being an equal to London in international financial transactions. So I think one of the things that's interesting about the world today is that there are multiple financial centers, and companies have a real choice about where they list, where IPOs happen, and the competition is getting pretty intense. It's no longer just a nylon world, New York, London. It's nylon Kong, New York, London, Hong Kong, and then beyond that, Shanghai. So what is going to change the world the most in the next 20 years? Probably it would be a change in China's policy on its capital account and the convertibility of its currency. If China moves significantly to liberalize its capital account and pursues a policy of regionalizing and then internationalizing the renminbi as a currency, then we will see, for the first time in a long time, a new contender for reserve currency status. Now, this will be fraught with risk for the Chinese, because as soon as they relax capital controls, a lot of money is going to leave China, and that will certainly put some downward pressure on the Chinese currency. But I think this is something to watch, because it's very clearly something that's being discussed in Beijing as a policy option.
Would you agree that whatever happens, the United States will not play the central role that it has played in the past? That is, that it either shares, I'm just building on what you said, it shares responsibility with China, or there's a lot of tension in that relationship and China becomes a rival. But that one way or another, there's a diffusion of power, there's at least a tendency towards a more multipolar world. If you agree with that, my question is, what are the dangers in a transition? You can have a system. We had the gold system. We had the British-dominated system. It transferred to the U.S. But this is a little different, it sounds to me, because this isn't passing the baton to one country. It's diffusing the situation. It's diffusing financial power. And I'm wondering, from a historical perspective, what comes to your mind in terms of what should we be braced for, and ultimately, are there the roots here of a more stable system?
Well, in Kindleberger terms, this is obviously rather unnerving, because there's the prospect of divided hegemony once again. Only this time divided between the US and China rather than the US and the UK. But as I tried to suggest earlier, I have a few reservations about the power of that explanatory framework. One important point to emphasize is that we already transitioned to a kind of multipolar financial world in the 1970s and 1980s. The Bretton Woods system that had been created essentially by British and American policymakers towards the end of World War II, fell apart in the early 1970s. And in the aftermath, financial decision-making passed to 7 countries, the group of 7 countries, and decisions taken by those countries related not just to exchange rates, but to the transition to a much more open world economy in which capital flows could be much larger than they had been in the Bretton Woods world. So we've already seen multipolarity in international financial terms, and we've seen it on an even more ambitious scale in terms of the regulation of trade. There is no World Financial Organization. There is nothing that has the World Trade Organization's power. Of course, the IMF is important, as is the World Bank, but they don't have the kind of power over sovereign states that the WTO has. So I would prefer to think of our situation today as being multipolar already, but with more players than there were in the 1980s. We've gone from G7 to G20. During the crisis, there was a period when I think the G20 played an important part and when international coordination was probably pretty crucial in avoiding a Great Depression. It was very short-lived because in the aftermath of the really bad phase of the crisis, in the aftermath of 2008, 2009, there were increasingly national conversations about regulation in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in the Eurozone. These conversations diverged. And although we have an international regime for bank capital called Basel III, it's not the most important game in town from the vantage point of financial market actors. The most important game in town is the national regulatory framework of the town you're in. So if you're in New York, you have to worry about Dodd-Frank. If you're in London, you have a completely different set of issues to worry about in the wake of the Vickers report. So I think what's happened is that while on paper we have at least 20 players getting together where we used to just have 7, in reality, we don't have as much international coordination as we had back in the days of the Louvre Accord. We're actually in a world in which national legislation, national regulation dominates, and there is strikingly little harmony between the different frameworks that are being created. And of course, this creates all kinds of opportunities, regulatory arbitrage being one. And we have the spectacle of the British government pretty openly touting for international business, most recently by saying that London will be the most Sharia compliant financial centre in the Western world. This seems to me symptomatic of a kind of process of centrifugal disintegration. And I think this is quite concerning, because I think we need to remember that the risk exists of a future crisis. Not all the things that caused the crisis have gone away, and some of them may even have got worse. And yet, I think we've moved away from meaningful international cooperation and coordination on the big questions of monetary and financial regulation. And it looks a lot more like a world of competing financial centers and competing nation states who act as their hosts.
That's fascinating. What would have to happen in order to reverse that centrifugal momentum? What does history tell us about the forces that would kind of force, if not total harmony, a different trajectory?
The big problem is that in the late period of World War I, and even more so in the final phase of World War II, the anticipation of peace created the perfect setting for the promulgation of new rules. And when John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White were hammering out what became Bretton Woods, they were able to do so because of the exceptional circumstances of a world war and the approach of a new era peace. We have gone through a huge experiment in fiscal and monetary policy since 2008 without a war, because the wars that the United States has fought in the past 12 years are quite small wars historically, and for most Americans it hasn't ever really felt like wartime. This is equally true in a largely demilitarized Europe. So policymakers can't say, peace is coming, a new era is approaching, and here are new and ambitious rules by which we can live. Nor can they say, peace is coming, now we must write down some of these extraordinary debts that we've run up, or we must pay new taxes to afford them. None of this is available to us. Our biggest problem, and I think this is true around the world, is that because we can't proclaim peace, we can only proclaim the end of the crisis. It's very difficult to justify major changes in anything, from taxation to financial regulation. And that's our problem. We have had all the symptoms of war in monetary and fiscal terms without the reality. And so we don't really have the option of declaring peace and doing something new and radical and idealistic. In the end, what we're left with is pragmatism and technocracy, people tinkering with the rules about bank capital adequacy, people altering the rules that govern capital flows in and out of countries, stuff that to the ordinary man or woman in the street is baffling and boring in equal measure.
So the final question is, as a historian, do you think that we could continue with this tinkering, attempt to patch things up, muddling through, for how long? Is it possible that basically this, let's call it the system that we have or the non-system that we have, is actually a system that could be sustained for generations? That the notion, let's say, that somewhere out there is an agreement of a Bretton Woods type, or a real, let's say, a big kind of breakthrough, and I don't want to put a value judgment on it, let's say a super regulator, a global regulator, that this stuff very well may not happen it may never happen, but it's possible that we, absent one of those cataclysmic events that you were talking about, a major revolution, a war, what we have is what we're going to see for a long time.
History is often just about muddling through, and major crises don't happen that often. Right. Historians love to study the wars, the revolutions, the financial crises. They neglect the boring years, but the boring years are in the majority. So we ought to consider the probability as being quite high that we'll just muddle through. And that's how Europe avoided the breakdown of the Eurozone. It's how the United States avoided Great Depression 2.0. We've muddled through, and we probably will muddle through some more. But certain things are clearly unsustainable. The United States has an unsustainable fiscal policy. That's clear. The deficit may have gone down a bit this year and a little bit more next year and the year after, but the Congressional Budget Office projects it to grow again pretty soon. And the debt burden, however you want to measure it, is going to get unsustainable at some point in let's say a 25-year time frame, unless there's some kind of productivity miracle in the US economy or a political miracle in Washington, D.C. that leads to an agreement on entitlement reform and tax reform. Not very likely the way things look at the moment. So there's an unsustainable element there. I think there's another bigger unsustainable problem. Monetary authorities around the world, from Beijing to Washington, by way of Frankfurt, not to mention London, are engaged in policies that fundamentally increase inequality. The notion that you bring about recovery with zero interest rates and large-scale asset purchases so that assets appreciate in value, stock markets go back to where they were in 2007, real estate markets go back to where they were in 2007, has a fundamentally regressive character. The beneficiaries of these policies are the people who hold assets. The recovery that we see in the United States today is a recovery for the 1%. It is not a recovery that the 99% are experiencing. Indeed, the median household's income in real terms is back where it was in 1989. For me as a historian, that's the greater concern, that we are technocratically muddling our way through reform and recovery, but in ways that promote inequality and, it seems to me, potentially social instability. Now, so far, nowhere has blown up in Europe and nowhere has blown up in North America. But the Middle East blew up in the midst of the financial crisis. It is no coincidence that there was a full-blown revolution in the Arab world. It had a lot to do with the inflated commodity prices and the impact that they had on households across North Africa and the Middle East. So as financial historians, as people interested in regulation and international financial systems, we need to remember that there are very strong connections between what happens in our silo, the fascinating world of reserve currencies and so forth, and what happens right next door in the silo-marked war and the silo-marked revolution. And I think the most important lesson of history is, sure, these events aren't too commonplace. You probably have to wait another generation before you have another financial crisis as big as 2008, 2009. But you may not have to wait so long for a really big war or indeed another revolution of the sort that we've already seen in the Middle East. Remember, 1929 is the beginning of the Great Depression, and 1939, 10 years later, is the beginning of World War II. So the lesson of financial history is watch out for the aftershocks. Financial crises are not purely financial in their consequences.
There couldn't be a better place to stop. Thank you very much. That's a terrific analysis, and even much more than I hoped for, and I had great expectations.